So hopefully you were all able to see and enjoy that introduction, and wanted to welcome all of the wonderful friends that we have joining us here today. Today's panel is on using all available resources for safer, friendlier flying. My name is Eve Lopez, and I'm thrilled to be amongst so many of you friends this morning, and to be joined by my good friends, Carol Ford and Jared Yoshiki. For those of you who may have seen the movie, although it's an older movie entitled The Three Faces of Eve, that's exactly who I will be today. I will be having my face on as an FAA safety team rep, awarding Wings credits today. I'll also be the moderator for this panel and one of the speakers. So similar to what you might have seen by the introduction, this panel will be just a little bit different than what we would consider typical. Part of aviation safety that is often not talked about are resources about fostering better relationships with the community that surround the airports over which we fly. And while it may be unorthodox to consider building relationships or friendships or partnerships as part of safety, it actually is very inherent and integral when we talk about aviation safety, to talk about the relationships that we have with the community members for the airports over which we fly. So today we're going to be focusing on somewhat of a simple trilogy. Part one is, how do we as pilots do our part to ensure that we are flying friendly? And I'll be leading that discussion. Part two of the trilogy will be about building friendships or partnerships with airport managers, which will be led by Carol Ford. And lastly, will be about building relationships with community members, including your electeds, which is going to be led by Jared. So to get things started, we're going to continue on with our theme here. Oops, if this will, there we go. So firstly, continuing on with the friends theme, there are several things that we as pilots can do to help ensure safety in terms of disposing of our obligations while also being good stewards of the sky. And so we're going to talk about this big surprise as a trilogy. So part one with the initial part, the fry, part two, the end, and part three, the S. So part one has to do with, in large part, believe it or not, our friends, perhaps with a different connotation, but our friends at the FAA, and the partnership that we are required, perhaps not elected, but mandatory to have with the FAA, and really some efforts that the FAA is making to help facilitate a more positive partnership with us as pilots. Some runway issues that have to do with those near the airports. And then lastly, is going to be identifying some risks that we don't traditionally consider when we fly. So first, the FAA, in their effort to try and establish better partnerships with us as pilots, they have a new series, or a more heightened series, that you can find on FAA.gov, and it's called From Their Flight Deck. There are three components, or three primary components, to this particular resource. There are videos that we'll talk about in just a second. There are arrival alert notices, and then something that's called a pilot handbook. So starting with flight deck videos, these are not with respect to every airport, but what the FAA has done is they have taken certain airports where they're are more likely to be, I'll use the word endangered, meaning the relationship between the airport and the community is strained. And so the FAA has filmed a number of videos for those particular airports that describe what to consider when flying at those airports. So it has to do with, obviously, with airspace and traffic patterns, because we want to be mindful of where the dense populations are when we're entering into a pattern, but we also want to be first and foremost engaged with the safety of how we enter those traffic patterns. It also talks about things such as identifying wrong runways or surface risks that need to be mitigated, as well as some other topics that have to do with engaging with uh, particular flight patterns, noise abatement, those sorts of things while we're flying at these particular airports. There's also arrival alert notices, and I was a little confused as to what they meant and why these are. But these are in large part for airports where there are parallel runways, and there may have been a pilot or two that was given a clearance for example, a 1-3 right and landed on 1-3 left. And so what the FAA has done is they have provided these graphics visually depicting the approach so that misalignment can be mitigated and pilots know what to expect visually before flying into that particular airport. One of the newest tools that the FAA has provided us as pilots to help us better prepare for our flights is something called the Pilot Handbook. And this is actually an interesting concept. So this is a 4 or 5 page document, depending on which airport there is, that describes such things as from the flight deck videos with the QR code linked to it. It has visual depictions of hotspot areas on the surface area itself. So on the screen is Santa Monica. We actually have a zipper on the surface, which is not something that we went across readily in other airports. And so these pilot handbooks explain the oddities with that particular airport. And one of the very unique things about these pilot handbooks is that they actually contain input from the local controllers at that field that tell us as pilots what to expect. So in Santa Monica, we have an unusual protocol that requires you to call ground for clearance to taxi, 50 feet from the run up to the hold short line. And so these pilot handbooks documents describe that in some detail so that we as pilots know what to expect. Then lastly, in order to find whether your particular airport or the airport you'll be visiting has any of these additional resources, on the FAA's page, you have to actually filter by state. So this was somewhat confusing when this first rolled out, because on the FAA site, you actually have to scroll down in order to find the particular areas that it is applicable. And then moving on to R. So this is what I'm going to term as runway, but how is runway related to safety and relationships with the community? Well, there's a number of things that have and could happen, but I want to just focus on three resources that we have that will help promote runway safety. Firstly, the FAA has a runway safety pilot simulator. I actually had one of my students work with this simulator. It's quite fascinating. What it does is it's somewhat like a simulator, but for taxiing, and it allows the student to interact with ATC and follow the directions given. So there are a number of circumstances under which a student or a pilot is told to, taxi to the run up via Alpha hold short of 26 or whatever the instruction is. And the student then has to read it back and appropriately manage their route of travel to coincide with the clearance that they were given. So I found that to be extremely, extremely helpful. Secondly, the FAA every year operates or runs these meetings that we refer to as RSATs, Runway Safety Action Team. I was given permission by the RSAT manager for the Western region to provide his contact information, including his email. So anyone who wants to attend a runway safety action meeting for your particular airport email our friend, our partner, Joe Santori at joe.santori@faa.gov, and he'll put you on the list to receive notices of when those runway safety meetings are to occur. One particular aspect of the RSATs that we have seen more regularly is particularly at endangered airports. There is a tendency or a move toward having run-ups be located in the middle of a run. Well, I'll say in the mid area of where the runway are parallel to a taxiway, if that makes sense. In other words, to remove it from being at the ends of the runway. And the reason for that is because as you get closer to the ends of the runway, you are moving closer to residents. And that has an effect on noise. And so one of the things that's discussed at these RSAT meetings are whether there's going to be any moving of the run-up areas, which tends to happen more often than not as of late. And then lastly, this kind of bootstraps off of something that Rod talked about this morning about permanence and what you expect to happen, and when things aren't that way, what happens in your own mind. And because of that, there have been a number of incidents where pilots were instructed to line up and wait. And rather than line up and wait, pilots line up and go. And that has caused a number of safety concerns. And so the FAA has now put out a new line of videos called Line Up and Wait. And so that is also available on the FAA site. Now, moving on to I. This is a big part of what Carol and Jared will be talking about here in just a moment. And that has to do with identifying risks. Typically, when we talk about risks, we all know the I'm safe, paved, all of those mnemonics that we have to ensure that we as pilots have identified whether we're fit to fly, whether there's some human factors that might be impeding on our ability for safe passage. I would introduce another risk, a different type of risk, and that actually has to do with a risk to our airports. We have residents who are vocal. We have, as Carol mentioned earlier, we have outside forces that are seemingly having an interplay on airports and their viability in the long term. That includes the argument about lead in aviation. And so I think we as pilots need to start acknowledging these risks and discussing amongst ourselves and in organizations like CalPilots how we can best mitigate those risks. And so when we talk about the end part of our friends, there are three brief components we're going to discuss. The first is our electronic flight brief. So Mike's going to be having a much more involved session later on today about EFBs. But in relation to our partnership with the FAA, there's a few things that we have, a few tools that we have in our electronic toolbook that I wanted to, or our electronic toolkit that I wanted to bring to your attention. So in ForeFlight, we actually now have that pilot handbook that's available on the FAA's website. It's actually now available in ForeFlight, and that is because the FAA has made friends with ForeFlight, and they are in a partnership to share some of this information. So this pilot handbook being one of them. Those arrival alerts for particular airports that have parallel runways, those too are also available in ForeFlight. And then one perhaps maybe not as commonly known electronic tool that you have is something from ChartAware. And what this is it is an overlay. It's an overlay that you can download onto ForeFlight that will show you as a layer where all of the practice areas are, at least here in Southern California. This helps significantly because if we're worried about some communities that are, for some reason, they don't like the noise of our aircraft, I'm perfectly fine with it, but others may not be. And so for those who are less inclined to appreciate the noise, there are designated practice areas that tend to be away from those residents or from the densely populated areas of residents. And it's helpful to know where those are so that we as pilots can do our part to help mitigate noise complaints. And then the N in our friends is something we've talked about just briefly, which is noise abatement. Those procedures can be found from the flight deck video, in the AFD, which we'll talk about next, in the pilot handbook we've just talked about, and on websites. So oftentimes the noise abatement publications or procedures rather will be noted on airport websites. There are also in the AFD. So in the AFD, there's the airport remarks section and the noise section. Those are where you're going to find the best information so that we as pilots can fly responsibly and friendly around those airports, particularly those such as Torrance, Reed Hillview, and Santa Monica that are at a critical stage in terms of their longevity. And then finally, the S is for socials. So I'll put this website as a social. So we have a website, Fly Friendly SoCal. That website, if you click on each of the various airports, it will identify what the noise abatement procedures are. And so you don't need to fish through any particular FAA publication if for some reason that doesn't sit well. We have a Fly Friendly SoCal website that you can take a look at, and we'll have those noise abatement procedures as well. There are also comments in ForeFlight that you can pay attention to that have to do a lot with airport relations that Kara will discuss here in just a moment. And there's Facebook groups that are a good resource for if you're coming into an area that you're unfamiliar with and you might have some questions and just want to get a little bit of reassurance on local procedures. This would be a good place to start, or at least to ask some of those questions. So going to stop this. I'm now going to turn things over to Carol for our second part of this trilogy to discuss making friends with your airport manager. Carol?
Thank you so much, Eve. That was so informative in a friendly fashion. So one of the things that pilots don't organically understand is that the airport manager is our friend. And they have a target on their back from the pilots and the elected officials. So, and they're trying to run the airport. So it can be quite complicated. And what we can do to ease that is understand what they have to do and why. Why do airport managers do what they do? And it's because the pilots don't understand how the grant assurances work, and that the airport managers are constrained by these rules, which are really laws from the FAA, when they get a grant, that they have to do certain things. And you know, it pertains for everything from using hangars to store airplanes to being sure that airworthy airplanes are in hangars, all sorts of rules. And that's why they do that. And so if we understand it, we can make life easier for ourselves and for them. So, and it's about safety. Airport managers aren't necessarily pilots, so we have to explain to them different issues, especially if we have safety concerns. And so then there can be a meeting of the minds and to see what we could do to make things smoother. I also happen to belong to the community association where I live. And where I live is under the flight pattern of San Carlos Airport. So any complaints from the neighborhood would be about San Carlos Airport, and I would know about them from the airport side and also from the community association. So I'm on that board, and the community association knows that. So a few months ago, they asked if they could have a tour of the airport. And I thought that was a brilliant idea and wondered why I hadn't thought of it sooner. So I contacted the airport manager. Oh yes, I'm also the president of the San Carlos Airport Association. So I know the airport manager, and I contacted her, Gretchen Kelly, and told her that different members of the community on the board would like to have, on the board of the Redwood Shores Community Association, would like to have a tour of San Carlos Airport. She readily agreed, organized vans for it. We figured out a date, and she was able to get permission from the tower for us to go in the tower and have a tour of the tower. We both impressed on everyone taking the tour how unusual that is to be able to go in the tower. They were all very interested, thrilled, and asked very interesting questions, and also listened carefully, because one of the controllers explained that the voluntary noise abatement procedures, have to be voluntary because no other local laws can't control airplanes in the air, and why sometimes pilots must deviate from the noise abatement procedures for safety reasons. And when the community people understood that, they thought that was fantastic to understand, because they had heretofore been quite complaining, oh, why did that pilot fly over there? They're not supposed to. We have noise abatement procedures. And they didn't understand deviation can be safety related. But once they did, they were very understanding. Oh, the pilot isn't just trying to be mean. They have a reason for doing this. That made a huge difference in the community. Also, Gretchen had little tote bags for everybody and gave everyone things like a thermos and a sock, socks with it fly friendly and the logo from San Carlos Airport on it. They were a big hit. And and seeing the tower was also a big deal. Everybody really appreciated it. So also in the community and surrounding neighborhood, a few years ago, we had what we call Bring a Plane to School Day. There's a school about 2 miles from the airport. And yes, all schools should be at least 2 miles from an airport. It's a California Division of Aeronautics rule. So there's an airport about 2 miles away, and we organized the Redwood Shores Community Association, the County of San Mateo, the San Mateo Sheriff's Department, the airport, the San Carlos Airport Association, the Redwood Shores Community Association brought popsicles for everyone. And all these organizations worked together. Oh, yes, and the Hiller Museum. We worked together to bring a small plane on a flatbed truck out to the school. We also brought a kit plane with fold-up wings on a flatbed out to the school. And we had some other kind of things. And we set up stations in the schoolyard to have children look at. There was a plane they could look in. There were the model planes. There were all sorts of things for them to look at, including a friend who was a pilot. She had won many awards. She's since deceased. That was Karen Morse, and she had pink headsets that she let all the kids try on. Girls and boys loved it. And so we had a big day. There were about 500 children at the school. The principal wanted me to address the whole assembly because she knows I'm a woman and a pilot. And so she wanted all the kids to know about that. That was so effective that 2 years after this happened, one of my friends is a substitute teacher, and she had the children write an essay. And several of them mentioned this when the planes came to school day as a big event that they chose to write their essay on. So there's things that we can do and replicate throughout the state that aren't expensive or hard to do. Both of the things I mentioned are easy to replicate, and I urge everyone to get in touch with their airport manager to work together for this type of event. Thank you, Eve.
Thank you, Carol. And so in addition to us as pilots doing our part to be responsible members of the community, to fly friendly, and also to make friends and partnerships with our airport managers, it's equally important for us to have those same friendships and partnerships with members of the community. And so here to talk about that today is Jared. Jared, your controls.
Yeah, thanks, Eve. And again, thanks for having me be a part of this. And A couple of things I think that dovetail nicely are some things that Carol said about how airport managers are kind of integral to the success of airports, period. I think we as pilots often too have to remember that airport managers basically serve two masters. They serve us as the users, but then they are also servants of their respective city councils, their respective airport advisory commissions, et cetera. So doing anything that might be adversarial to the wishes of their elected officials can create friction, obviously, between us and them. And so the purpose of, I think, what I want to talk about today has a lot to do with how we interface with elected officials, how we talk to elected officials, how we talk to members of the community. And I think for a long time, we've gotten a very bad rap, unfortunately. And I think it's important for us to really stay positive about flying. Flying is cool. I mean, we all love to take the airplane out, love to go, especially if you're a member of EAA and taking some of the kids flying. It's incredibly, it's an incredible experience to take someone up in the air for the first time, show them, the perspective of their community, of their airport, of their house from a completely different perspective. And I can't tell you how sometimes eye-opening that can really be, to Carol's point about inviting them into the fence. In some instances, I think one of the worst issues we have as pilots and as airports is the fact that there's a huge fence around the airport. So it looks like Bushwood Country Club, where we can't let normal people onto the airport. And I think, that's where we get a bad reputation. So being more inviting, showing them the airport, inviting them onto the ramp, showing them airplanes, getting the kids involved, talking about how positive flying is, how amazing aviation is, and the ancillary effects of that of what are the amazing careers and educational opportunities, life-changing opportunities that aviation brings potentially to their families. As an example, when I was in a state legislature in Hawaii about 2 years ago, a year ago or so, I had a legislature who literally told me they just thought pilots grew on trees and didn't understand that, as somebody who's not in the military, who wants to get all of their ratings and go fly for American or Southwest, I got to get my 1,500 hours and, burn the pavement, every 100, 200, 300, 500 times, et cetera, before I can even get those wings to even fill out an application. And I really think, the idea that we can educate and be very respectful to their stature as elected officials in trying to educate them on, look, these are really good paying jobs and careers that are going to benefit your community in the long term, benefit the people who live in your community and their families in the long run, are incredible storylines, are incredible talking points that we can continue to promote and to address. The big problem we have right now, unfortunately, is really education. And that's where I want to tie this back to. As many of you know, politics is a ladder climbing industry. And when you get elected to the school board, your next step is usually city council, and then it's to the board of supervisors, and then it's to the state assembly, and then it's to the state senate, and then it's to US Senate or Congress, and then, who knows from there. As a chief of staff, as a former chief of staff to a state senator, I've been in these trenches for far too long. I've seen these political personalities continue to follow that same step ladder. And what that really creates for us is a big education gap and a very steep learning curve, sometimes every 2 years, sometimes every 4 years, sometimes sooner if we have special elections and whatnot. So your ability to make friends with your elected officials, your neighborhood associations, the people who might be serving on some of these boards and commissions is extremely important. And doing so in a way where we don't use the common phrase of the airport was here first. That phrase in today's political environment just pun intended does not fly anymore. And unfortunately, the land use decisions of 20 and 30 years ago are really causing some of these issues to come home to roost. And so I think the idea of saying, hey, how can we be more solutions oriented? How can we be more positive and collaborative in our approaches? I don't think anybody on any pilot whatsoever wants to, buzz a house 100 times, just because they file noise complaints, And sure, are there those people out there? Of course there are. But I don't think anybody does it maliciously or intentionally. And it goes back to that educational mindset of sometimes we have to fly that pattern. Sometimes a tower, air traffic control, et cetera, tells us to fly a certain direction or on a certain pathway that is out of our control as pilots. The problem is we have to be more inviting to them to want to understand those processes. And we can't do that if we always have the negative connotation of, well, you were the one who chose to live by the airport or yada, yada. Yeah, unfortunately, that squeaky wheel will go directly to their city council member or to their elected officials. And then we get the situation we have today. I really appreciate Doug bringing up some of the lead stuff about Reed Hillview. I mean, that's how that started. The fact that the facts don't matter anymore. It doesn't matter what lead study you show, what, specific health study you show to an elected official. If it has a buzzword, if it has a trigger word, it gets into the letters to the editor, it gets into the op-ed pages, it gets to the front of the line of the messaging talking points for a lot of these individuals. And so the thought process here is we need to become that same squeaky wheel. We need to be an advocacy group of our own to really not only support our freedoms to fly, but our ability to support our local airports, which in truth are the acorns that became the oaks of our community. They were the initial main streets of our communities before they grew and before they, started to expand beyond their old boundaries. So I think the more we can, really spread positive efforts or spend positive words and messaging on not just airports, but on us as pilots, what we are trying to do in the future of aviation. Gil talks a lot about AAM, which is a really awesome and cool technology. We've got autonomous potentially cars coming, but I think a lot of us know the realism of autonomous flying. Might be to some extent some pie in the sky, but it's coming. It is coming. It is something that is going to make aviation hopefully potentially safer. But in the short term, we require airports, we require pilots, we require well-trained pilots, we require safe pilots. We require all of these things that make a family traveling from Sacramento to Orange County to go to Disneyland on a weekend significantly safer for everybody involved. And that requires airports. It requires consistent training. And it requires doing some of the things that Eve talked about of knowing before you go, where you're flying to, understanding the community around you. And I think the more if we can promote that type of messaging to our elected officials to say, we as pilots care about that community. We care about where we fly, and we want to do in as safe as possible, but also with the mindset that we care about the community that's below us. And we're really not doing this as a way to make you upset or to target you in any way, shape, or form. We want those same topics as well. And I think the more we can, again, be more inviting, change the language we use. It's not about the word no, it's about, well, this is what I can do. Tell me what your problem is. Or it's engaging with elected officials themselves. They answer to you also. So don't be afraid to talk to them. You should not be afraid to reach out to your member of a board of supervisor. You should not be afraid to reach out to your state assembly member. And it doesn't matter what, stripe or color they are. Reach out to them, talk to them, be positive, be humble, understand that they are not pilots, that they have no clue what you're talking about when you say, oh, well, we can use a VX climb to go out of Long Beach. Yeah, that's not necessarily a good thing because we as pilots know what that is, but the normal run-of-the-mill elected official, they don't understand. They're just going to be, oh, the pilot's going to get as high as possible in a short amount of time. Okay, cool. That's what we want too. That may not be the safest option. So understanding, who you're talking to and that their level of knowledge is going to be significantly less than yours is incredibly important. And the last example I'll give you on that topic is even when talking to Senator Menjivar and her staff on the lead bill, I pulled up ForeFlight. I wanted her to see that if Whiteman Airport was to be the test case, let's say, for an unleaded fuel, that all of the yellow on ForeFlight around Whiteman Airport was the city of Los Angeles, and that she was potentially putting a new fuel in a heavily populated area. And again, trying to explain to her the safety aspects of you're not giving us pilots a lot of outs if something happens. So be mindful of that. But again, I brought the education, I brought the messaging down just a little bit so she could kind of understand what's going on. So my biggest takeaway in, trying to ask you as fellow pilots in your local communities, especially here in California, we have so many threats from so many different vectors that it's important to spread positive messaging. It's important to talk about the importance of our airports, the importance of aviation, the future of aviation why it's so necessary, and do so in a very humble and respectful manner. Because the last thing they want to hear is why you're right or why they're wrong. And the last thing I'll say on that point is it's also got to be a 15-second to 30-second soundbite. If it takes you more than a minute to 3 minutes to explain what it is you're talking about, you've lost them. They are completely not paying attention anymore. It's got to be something that they can stand in front of a camera potentially and defend their position. So, you can't use the long diatribes, unfortunately. It's just the sadness, I would say, of the political class we currently live in. But it's the short attention spans are just not going to give you the ability to say what you want to say in the length of time you want to say it. So again, be succinct, but again, be respectful. And that's the one thing I want you to say is be respectful. Understand again that they don't necessarily know what you're talking about. And so the more that we as AOPA can help you as CalPilots, the more that my team of regional managers can help with that type of messaging. We are all here for that. That's exactly what we want to do. We want to continue to collaborate with CalPilots. We want to continue to collaborate with our friends at NATA and VAI and MBAA and the rest of the alphabet organizations to try and put a solid foot forward in trying to create positive messaging around airports. Because if we don't, the allure of all kinds of things is coming, whether it's housing in California, developers wanting to take land. All of these threats are against airports, and they have nothing to do with aviation. So we need to make sure we have a strong flag to plant, and that's really going to start with how we talk to people. So thanks, Eve. That's what I wanted to say.
So Jared, when there is an encounter with a pilot and a member of the community, rather than the pilot saying, the airport was here first, what would you suggest that the pilot say to that community member instead?
I think it's about understanding what their concern is. We need to do a better job at listening. What is your concern? Is it just you don't like the airport? Do you don't like the noise? Do you not like, the color of the airplane? Do you not like the asphalt, on the runway? Like, what is it about the airport that you don't like? So from my perspective, when a member of the community comes up and, is very adversarial, try and understand what their issue is. What are they complaining about? If it's noise, for example, talk about, well, what kinds of noise are you talking about? Is there a specific location? Can you show me on a map where this noise is? Really try and let them talk and let them be heard. I think we don't do a good job sometimes of listening. We do a lot more talking. And I know I'm talking a lot, so I apologize for that. But I think more listening is really the key there. Is we need to be active listeners to try and understand where really the community is coming from. Because I'll tell you what, it is definitely a vocal minority. I don't think you're finding lots of troves of people who live in a community who are just completely up in arms with pitchforks and torches trying to shut the airport down. I think it's a extremely small community that is influenced by others, and that just perpetuates and it starts to spread and become more pervasive. But I definitely think there are those people who are like, oh wait, there's an airport around here. Like I didn't know that. So again, understanding what that issue is and trying to really listen and be attentive to what their concern is really the first and most important part of that whole example.
And Carol, if there is a pilot who perhaps does not have a relationship yet with their airport manager, what might you suggest they do in order to try and establish a relationship with the airport manager on their home field?
I would suggest going and making an appointment and going and seeing them and talk to them and find out what their problems are. Just what Jared said was great about listening to what their issues are, because I don't think we as a whole, as pilots, understand the difficulties that they deal with, because they have it from all sides, which Jared also mentioned, because they have elected officials which have certain expectations of them. They have management of leases on the airport from businesses. God willing, they have businesses on the airport, and they have hangar leases that they have to deal with. So there's a lot on their plate, and it probably would be helpful to understand that. So just meeting them first, and then seeing if you could do some kind of joint effort with local pilots and the community, which I talked about before. Those are all good ways to break the ice. And Eve, if I could answer a question which someone put in the question and answer, they were talking about notification that they knew there was an airport lived there. Well, the San Carlos Airport Association worked with Joe Simidian, who was, when he was in the assembly, now he's a supervisor for Santa Clara County, but we worked with him about 20 years ago. He sponsored a bill, AB 2776 in California, and it was to notify people that they were moving into an area where there was already an airport, and electrical interference and smog or who knows what else. All these things were listed in the bill, would be near where you live. And you sign that as a standalone document when you buy a house near an airport in California. And so that is a way that we've tried to deal with that notification.
Great. Thank you, Carol, and thank you, Jared.